Hello and welcome to Loredive, where we look into the lore of all of our favorite games. Today we are diving right back into Dead by Daylight, an asymmetrical horror game where one killer tries to hunt down and sacrifice up to 4 survivors. Today we are looking at the second group of killers, the nurse, the hag, the doctor, and the huntress. Sally Smithson, the nurse. Sally Smithson came to town with dreams of children's feet and laughter in a small, simple home built by her husband Andrew. But life came to her not with smiles and hope, but with misery and despair. Her husband Andrew worked as a lumberjack, a job not without its perils. One day, after a terrible accident, Andrew's foreman had to pay Sally a visit, forever changing her life. She was now alone in the world. Without food on the table and no other option, Sally had to find a way to survive. But the only employment she could get was the Crotus Pren Asylum, a place where nobody sought employment, unless they were in dire need and had no other place to turn, just like Sally. Without an education, she started at the bottom, doing the long, hard night shift. Sally was not alone at the asylum, but one could hardly say that these associates of Sally's were her friends. Sally found herself poorly treated by fellow nurse Morris, the priest who ran a small chapel on the grounds, Father Campbell, orderly of the premise, Harvey Kavanagh, and the man who both physically and verbally assaulted her on a regular basis, Crotus Pren Asylum's warden, Patrick Spencer. She found some sort of companionship in 2 patients that were well known to be Sally's favorites, Mary Jenner, an anxious girl who Sally oversaw, and a young, silent, catatonic boy. But these associates were not enough to prevent Sally's mind from gradually deteriorating. Over the years, her mind had reached its limits. 2 decades of seeing horrid things that violate the eyes and erode the senses. Memories that replayed in her nightmares night after night. Being abused verbally and physically by people who cared nothing for her, Sally saw insanity from the outside, before it eventually nestled itself inside. Finally, she could not take it anymore, and delusions and concepts of purification emerged inside her. She saw what was necessary, and would not hesitate. When the morning staff arrived one day in September, they found over 50 dead patients, lifeless in their bed, along with Sally's 4 staff members. Sally was found having survived the night, but her mind was gone as she sat rocking back and forth non-stop. Exactly what happened that night is known only by her, but it seems that some of them had been strangled to death as their necks were noticeably bruised. The paramedics got her into an ambulance, however, it never reached the hospital. It was found crashed in the nearby wood, all staff members dead, and Sally nowhere to be found. The nurse's unique power is Spencer's last breath. Having captured the final gasps of life from the warden Spencer as he died, the entity has given the nurse the ability to levitate as well as blink around the map. Blinking, however, is painful for the nurse, which can be verified by her screams as she does it. After a brief chain blink window that will allow the nurse to attack, she will go into a state of fatigue where she cannot interact with anything. Her levitation reduces her movement speed, where she actually moves slower than the survivors without using her blink. It would appear that the nurse pulls power from the spirit realm while blinking, similar to the Wraith. However, since she and the Wraith are not ghosts, it leaves them both vulnerable to light burn. For the nurse, a survivor would need to be on point in order to actually burn the nurse while she's blinking. Along with her teleporting ability, the nurse has her own perks that she has pulled from the entity, all coming from her background as a medical practitioner. Her first perk is Strider. The nurse is acutely sensitive to other people's breathing. With the Strider perk, the volume of breathing of survivors in pain is louder, with max rank also raising the volume of uninjured survivors as well. The nurse's second perk is Thanatophobia. The nurse's very presence causes the survivor's courage to fade when having to face their own mortality. Whenever a survivor is injured, all survivors' action speeds are reduced. If multiple survivors are injured, this reduced action speed will stack upon each other. However, if a survivor is killed, the penalty to everyone's action speed is removed for that player. The nurse's final perk is A Nurse's Calling. The nurse is sensitive to the needs of others. If a survivor is healing within a certain range of the nurse, she will be able to see their aura. This will of course allow the nurse to come in help them with their troubles. Sally now glides across the entity's playground, finding survivors and doing what she does best, making sure that everyone she comes into contact with will leave her company without any pain or worries, though that may not be in their best interest. Lisa Sherwood, the Hag. Lisa Sherwood grew up in a quiet village, mainly isolated from the rest of civilization. The people of the hamlet were kind, and the elders kept the old traditions alive, often keeping the peace by personally settling the ever-rare disputes. Lisa was particularly fond of the charms that they taught her to draw for safety and good fortune. One night, as she was walking home through the woods, a terrible storm struck without warning. Howling winds whipped at her hair as she stumbled through the swamp, her rain-drenched dress plastered to her skin. In the slick, wet mud, she lost her footing, careening backwards and striking her head against a rock. Slipping in and out of consciousness, she strained to identify the dark shades approaching her between the trees. This was the last thing that she could remember as the world faded to black. Her kidnappers kept her chained to the wall of a flooded cellar. Though dimly lit, she could see others whose large open wounds swarmed with flies. It took only a day before they returned, carving chunks from the prisoners' bodies with rusted blades, consuming their very flesh down to the bone. Most she saw did not survive long once the cannibals targeted them, but somehow, deep within, Lisa persisted. Starved, infected, and mutilated after several weeks of torture, her gaunt arms became loose in their shackles. She pulled hard, the metal tearing through her skin and muscle until she was free. Her flesh oozed viscous yellow pus, and bones were visible beneath gangrenous wounds. She could go no further. Delirious, she thought of home. She thought of the elders, and with her dying breath, she etched the symbols they taught her into the floor, using what remained of her fingers. Almost in response, a dark hunger stirred inside her. It yearned for blood, and it would be sated. The symbol she wrote needed an emotion to cling to. She chose vengeance. The village's search party eventually found them to an old shack in the swamp. Inside, its previous inhabitants had been viciously dismembered and devoured by an unidentifiable animal. In the cellar, amid rotting corpses and disconnected flesh, the elders' charms were scrawled in blood on the floor. Lisa was not among the bodies, and was never found. And after witnessing the horrors in that shack, the village was never the same again. The blackened catalyst is the Hag's main power. She creates deceitful duplicates of herself, made from the mud. The traps cannot be disarmed, but if a survivor shines a flashlight on the trap, it will be destroyed. Under normal circumstances, if a survivor trips one of these traps, the Hag will be able to teleport to this mud imitation. The Hag can place up to 10 traps, and if she tries to place another after reaching this max, it will destroy the oldest trap. The Hag's inclusion to the entity's arsenal of killers made a permanent change to the procedural. This is due to her bringing the ways of her village into the struggle, with twisted fetishes known as the totems. Each map has a total of 5 totems, which allow the killers to use more powerful perks called hexes. If a killer's perk requires the use of one of these totems, they will become lit. However, these totems can be destroyed by the survivors, meaning that these perks can be permanently disabled for the remainder of the procedural if located. Since the Hag's presence brought these hexes into the game, naturally, her perks are all about them. Her first perk is Hex, the Third Seal. With Hex the Third Seal, hitting a survivor will cause the blindness status effect, making aura reading of any kind impossible. This includes being unable to see other survivors who have been put on the hook. Her second perk is Hex Ruin. With Hex Ruin, all survivors are affected by the ability Ruin. Ruin makes good skill checks on generators cause regression to the generator, as well as stalling progress for a short duration. The only way to avoid this regression is to get a great skill check, though it will no longer provide a bonus to progression. Her final perk is Hex Devour Hope. The hag has found a way to feed on the hope of the survivors, much in the same way the entity does. If a survivor is saved from the hook while the hag is at least 24 meters away, she will get a token towards Devour Hope. At 2 tokens, the hag will begin to move faster, and at 3, the hag will be able to knock survivors down with a single hit. And finally, at 5 tokens, the hag will be able to kill survivors by her own hand. Lisa's ironic transition from poor victim to deadly killer has left her in a situation where she is probably the most monstrous creature in the procedural. Her dark magic and insatiable appetite will lead her to hunting down and devouring any survivor that she comes across. Herman Carter, the Doctor. From an early age, Herman Carter understood the human psyche, as having the chance to analyze and deconstruct something as powerful as the human brain intrigued him. He was an apt pupil and gained the attention of his teachers, excelling in high school, and was even published in The Partisan, a psychology gazette. Within a year, Carter was fast-tracked into Yale's advanced neuroscience program, which in reality was a front for the CIA. After all, brainpower is a must if you're going to conquer the world and demolish your foes across the pond. The CIA understood this, so interrogation and intelligence became their #1 priority. All they needed were brilliant people, like Carter. Carter and other top-tier recruits were transferred off-campus and into a secret black site facility in Illinois, known as Larry's Memorial Institute. A protege craves a mentor, and that's where Mr. Stamper stepped into the picture. He taught Carter that information is everything, and knowledge is power. He was given all the instruments needed and a guiding hand. More or less everything he'd asked for. He never realized that sunlight had started to become so scarce, and that he too was kept in the dark. Because knowledge doesn't only give you power, it also transforms you into a threat. Carter's missions were simple: extract the information from his subjects by any means necessary. Mr. Stamper encouraged Carter to go further, and not to consider this a normal medical facility. No eyes were watching them. There were no rules to abide. He pushed Carter in the right direction, and then took a few steps back to see how Carter would walk on his own. Docile test subjects were exchanged for real, live spies, people that played a role in the troubles outside the facility. Carter shouldered his new role, and Project Awakening took form. On paper, Carter described it as an experimental interrogation. It was approved despite questionable ethics, and over the next few months, nobody knocked on his door. Screams and moans filled the corridor outside his lab. But wars skew people and what they can accept, as long as the enemy is kept at bay. The fluorescent lights flickered more and more as electroconvulsive treatment became a standard dish on the menu. Prisoners held at the facility begged the guards to take them to any other lab but Carter's, and rumors about the horrifying conditions of Carter's workshop were disregarded, at least in the beginning. Over the years, Carter became known as the Doctor, though no one ever questioned if he even held a real medical certificate or what happened to the prisoners after they had given up their information. It was only after Larry's Memorial Institute went silent for a week that they finally uncovered the true horror of what happened there. Carter's experimental information extraction had turned into a horrific and bizarre torture. Patients and prisoners were found dead or in vegetative states, with all sorts of head trauma. In his office, they found the most terrible discovery of all. Mr. Stamper himself, his head peeled open and an array of electrodes and sensors inserted into his still working but completely annihilated brain. There was no sign of Herman the Dr. Carter, but his research paper suggested that he had been using the prisoners as part of awful ECT experiments, as he searched for the panacea of mind control. The government didn't want to know the results of Carter's research, nor ever searched for the man himself. The black site was condemned, and all knowledge of Larry's Memorial Institute was redacted from the pages of history. The Doctor's power is Carter's Spark. The entity has ignited and corrupted an inexhaustible spark in the Doctor's heart, which allows him to generate electroconvulsive power at will. This insidious treatment corrupts the minds of those it touches, and victims shocked begin to lose their grip on reality, and with repeated exposure, succumb to madness. The Doctor's first perk is Overwhelming Presence. The Doctor's mere presence instills great fear. Survivor within the Doctor's terror radius suffer from inefficiency. Inefficiency causes item usage to increase by 100%. The Doctor's second perk is Monitor and Abuse. Meticulous in the approach, and terrifying in the application. When the Doctor is not in chase, his terror radius is decreased by 8 meters from the normal 32. However, when he is in a chase, his terror radius increases an additional 8 meters than what it normally would be. On top of his changes to his terror radius, the Doctor's view is also increased by 10 degrees. The Doctor's final perk is Overcharge. The Doctor is fueled by his hate of progress. After hitting a generator and causing it to begin regression, the next survivor who works on the gen will be faced with a difficult skill check. If the survivor fails to hit the skill check, the generator will explode and have increased regression. It's hard to say if there's anything actually left of Herman Carter inside the Doctor's mad shell, as it seems that the Doctor's infectious madness has completely taken over. An infection that he wants to spread to every survivor that he comes across. Anna, the Huntress. As soon as Anna was able to walk, her mother started teaching her how to survive a harsh, solitary life in the northern forest. Living in such an extremely remote and dangerous area required skill and resilience. When sunlight became too dim for productive activities, they would take refuge in their house, a sturdy old cabin constructed to resist the toughest winters. Close to the hearth's warmth, Anna would rest in her mother's arms, surrounded by a few wooden toys and masks that she crafted for her. Drifting off to sleep with stories and lullabies, she dreamt happy dreams, ignorant of the events that would soon change everything. One day, Anna and her mother were stalking a great elk through the woods. They knew it was dangerous prey, but it had been a difficult winter, and they were almost out of food. The specter of starvation frightened them more than any forest creature, and so Anna's mother decided to take a risk that she wouldn't under normal circumstances. Without warning, the elk reared, bellowed, and charged at Anna. Still a little girl, she was paralyzed with fear, and the whole world seemed to shake under the immense beast's pounding hooves. The elk was close enough for Anna to see the murderous fury in its eyes, when her mother threw herself in its path, axe in hand. A blood-curdling scream escaped from her lips as the elk impaled her upon its antlers and hoisted her into the air. With all her strength, she brought the axe down on its head again and again while it tried to shake her loose. With a sickening crack, the antlers snapped and Anna's mother was free. The beast collapsed, too injured to move. Anna was too small to move her mother's broken body, so she sat with her in the clearing where she had fallen. To distract her from the dying elk's cries, Anna's mother did her best to hold her and hummed her favorite lullaby. They stayed like that, the Huntress and the elk getting quieter and colder, until death claimed the elk and Anna's mother hummed no more. Anna was alone in the silent red forest. Eventually she stood up and started the long walk back home, taking her mother's axe, and what parts she could claim from the elk back with her. Still a child, she knew just enough about life in the frozen forest to survive. She was without further guidance, and followed her instincts, becoming one with the wild. As a young girl, she worked her way up through squirrels and hares, mink and foxes. She got older and stronger, and practiced her hunt, and eventually transformed into a dangerous predator. Her humanity became a half-remembered dream. She widened her territory, and lived off of her hunts. Eventually she grew tired of her small prey and hunted more dangerous animals, like wolves and bears. When unsuspecting travelers came through her woods, she discovered her new favorite prey, humans. Unlucky souls who strayed into her territory were slaughtered like any other animal. She liked to collect their tools and their colorful garments, and especially toys when they were little ones. But she could never bring herself to kill the little girls. Little girls she would take back to her house, deep in the woods. They were precious, and looking at them woke up something deep within her heart. Something she could never fully grasp. She craved the closeness of a loved one, a child of her own. Among the pillaged wooden toys, dolls, and storybooks she couldn't read, the girls would be tied up by the neck with a rough and chafing rope fastened firmly to the wall. She couldn't let them wander off, or they would surely die outside. The sad irony of this is that, with no knowledge of how to take care of others, Anna's care was worse than the harshest winter. Every time, the girls would waste away and die of cold, starvation, or sickness. And with no knowledge on how to prevent it, every time it happened, it plunged Anna deeper into pain and sorrow. She was compelled to try again, and started raiding the nearest villages to slaughter families and kidnap their children. She often wore one of the animal masks her mother had crafted for her to try and calm the frightened children. Villagers spread the legend of a half-beast lurking within the Red Forest, the Huntress, who killed men and ate little girls. However, along with the rest of the world, war eventually came to the forest. German soldiers began to pass through on the march to attack the collapsing Russian Empire. During these dark times, there were no more travelers. The villagers had abandoned their homes, and no more little ones could be found. Only soldiers. The Huntress did not like these soldiers. Many of them were found with violent axe wounds, and whole platoons disappeared mysteriously. Once the war was over, the rumors of the Huntress disappeared with it. Whatever happened to Anna is unknown, but to this day people dread and fear what might be lurking in the Red Forest. The Huntress's first perk is Beast of Prey. Anna's desire to hunt is so intense that her will can overpower the entity, making her unpredictable. When the Huntress enters bloodlust, the red stain normally seen by survivors disappears, allowing the Huntress to move without warning the survivors which direction she is headed. The Huntress's second perk is Territorial Imperative. The Huntress knows when someone is invading her sanctuary. If a survivor enters the basement while the Huntress is at least 32 meters away, she will be notified of their presence, allowing her to return in order to protect her domain. The Huntress's final perk is Hex, Huntress's Lullaby. The power of the Hex gives the Huntress's Lullaby a power of its own that intensifies every time she is successful in one of her hunts. Every time she hooks a survivor, the time between when the survivors would normally hear a chime to warn them that they are about to receive a skill check, and when the skill check actually happens, shortens, and will eventually max out to where the survivors don't hear the skill check at all. Unlike most of the killers, Anna is a bestial creature, whose life hunting in the wilderness is virtually no different than hunting the survivors in the procedural. So, some of her victims might argue that she is right where she belongs. A hulking beast, enslaved by the entity. Thank you for watching our episode of Loredive. I really hope you enjoyed it. The next episode is actually going to be a break from Dead by Daylight, and instead we're going to be looking into the Resident Evil franchise. We will of course be coming back to Dead by Daylight though, with a look at the first 4 licensed survivors. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And with all that out of the way, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.